Today we're going to finish up the flood, and we're going to talk about geology. We're actually going to get into some science. We've been mainly talking about theology so far and what creationists typically believe as far as interpretations on Scripture. So we're going to actually get into some science. So last week we finished the pre-flood environment. We talked about giant tarantulas and other disgusting animals. We finished about half of the flood section where we talked about the flood, a flood of biblical proportions. And we're going to finish that up today. Then we're going to go into after the flood, what happened after the flood. And we're going to actually get into the last 30 minutes or so, we're going to get into geology, the first third or so of the geology presentation. So, where did all the water come from for the flood? This is a question that a lot of atheists ask. Well, there are two sources given in the Bible, fountains of the deep and the floodgates of heaven. It says all the fountains of the deep were opened and the floodgates of heaven were open. Fountain of the deep is, if you do a word study on it, it was used several times in the Old Testament. Fountains of the great deep is used in Genesis 7:11. Fountains of the deep are used in Genesis 8:2. The great deep is used 3 times. And the deep is used more often, usually refers to oceans, but sometimes to subterranean sources of water. It appears that fountains of the great deep is some unusual body of water that was pre-flood, that was underneath the land. That's as best we can tell what it was. Here's the hypothesis that the creationists have put forth, is that you've got the crust here, and underneath part of the crust you have this huge, vast body of water. And when it says the fountains of the deep broke forth, the earth's crust was broken during the flood, that body of water was under an immense amount of pressure from all the land that was on top of it, and it gushed up at supersonic speeds, meaning faster than the speed of sound, as best we can tell, as our calculations tells us. And this body of water doesn't exist today because it was pretty much drained during the flood, so we don't have it. But this is the general hypothesis that creationists will tell you about. So you see this fountain here spewing up water way up into the atmosphere, and it would precipitate down. Another hypothesis is that it could have been volcanoes. There's a lot of volcanic activity during and after the flood as the land settled and everything. It's been estimated that 70% of the mass exiting volcanoes is water. I found that fascinating. I thought that it was mainly ash and lava spewing out of volcanoes. And the ash is important for what happened after the flood, which we'll talk about. There's a lot of evidence for volcanic activity during the flood. The mountains of Ararat that Noah's Ark landed on are volcanic mountains that were laid down during the flood, and possibly underwater, possibly hardened underwater, I don't know. But when the earth cracked open, there's a lot of volcanic activity that occurred. And also after the flood, as things were settling down, there was a lot of plate tectonic movement, and there's a lot of volcanic activity then as well. Okay, the second source of water, windows of heaven. Windows of heaven is used twice in reference to the flood, 3 times elsewhere. Basically, from the little word study we did, the conclusion is that it's a term that's not applied to ordinary rainfall. There's something miraculous about the rainfall. And so, one charge that a lot of skeptics will make against creationists is that how could it have rained for 40 days and 40 nights nonstop? The air cannot hold that much water vapor. The world was tropical pre-flood, and so you had warm oceans. Well, warm oceans and all the water from the fountains of the deep bursting forth would have created big, huge hurricanes. Okay, usually hurricanes are a few hundred miles in diameter. These things are possibly thousands of miles in diameter. And that has enough potential to rain for 40 days and 40 nights nonstop. So that's one hypothesis. Could it ever rain enough to cover Mount Everest? Mount Everest is 29,000 feet. That's a good question. It's good to put things in perspective. The Earth is almost perfectly smooth. A cue ball on a pool table is rougher than the Earth, okay, even with Mount Everest. You can't even see Mount Everest from outer space. The Earth is so smooth. And because the Earth is so smooth, if you reduce the Earth to a 12-inch diameter globe, all of the oceans would fit into 1 tablespoon. Okay, so it doesn't take that much water to actually cover a significant part of the Earth. And it's funny that they wonder where all the water is that flooded the Earth, because the Earth is covered with 72% water right now. Okay, there's plenty of water on the Earth. There's 28% land. And not only that, the picture looks even better when you looked at the depth of the ocean. The ocean is 13,860 foot deep. The average height of land above sea level is 2,250 feet. So if you compare those ratios, you get a 1 to 13 ratio, water to land. There's plenty of water to flood the world. And the water that flooded the world is all around us now. And so the real question was, how tall were the pre-flood mountains? And you might assume, the Bible doesn't tell us, but you might assume that maybe they were a little bit shorter than they are today. They didn't have to absolutely be 29,000 feet like Mount Everest. Okay, well, where did all the water go? Good question. How did the water drain off the land? You've got this condition during the flood where everything's covered with water. And where did the water go? Good question. Went down the drain. Psalm 104, 7 through 9 says, "At your rebuke, the waters fled. At the sound of your thunder, they hurried away. The mountains rose and the valleys sank to the place you established for them." It's interesting how many allusions there are in Psalms to the pre-flood world. It makes you wonder what kind of documents King David had at his disposal. We don't know. This seems to be talking about the flood here. It basically says the mountains rose and the valleys sank, the water ran off. And is there any evidence that the mountains have risen and the valleys have sunk? Well, yeah, there is. When the first person to climb Mount Everest stuck his flagpole on the top of that mountain, he was sticking his flagpole into an ancient seabed, a pre-flood seabed. That mountain rose 29,000 feet from a seabed at one point in the past. Evolutionists will say that that was millions of years ago or hundreds of millions of years ago. We would say that that was pre-flood. Also, here's giant oysters that are found 2 miles up in Peru, 11.5 feet wide. I want to also mention that Dr. Baumgartner, who created Terra, T-E-R-R-A, was the acronym he used for his finite volume model program to analyze the mantle and the crust of the earth. And he also had a mechanism for the mountains rising and the valleys sinking and the water flowing off in his catastrophic plate tectonics model. And so it has been analyzed more in depth. I don't really talk about it here, but it's really interesting. You can look up stuff on ICI, Institute for Creation Research, about it. Could someone outswim the flood? No, you could not outswim the flood. No. It was a hugely catastrophic event. Beyond that, we have whales, dolphins, and fish, which are made to live in water that did not survive. You can't just hang on to a few logs and hope to last 371 days of the flood. It's not going to happen. Also, there's a lot of good evidences in geology for what's called sedimentary rock being laid down all at one time. You can almost see that this thing was flowing when it was covered over and became rock. You can see the flow lines real easily. Slick rock in Arizona. So to summarize, the flood was a hugely catastrophic event. All the land animals died. Everything that had in the breath of life in it perished. And the evidence points to a worldwide flood. The last thing I want to talk about is the ark, a great typology of Christ. It's a foreshadowing of Christ. Does anyone remember who shut the door of the ark? God shut the door of the ark. He sealed them in. And how many people entered the ark? 8. How many people exited the ark? 8. Everyone who took God's provision for this coming judgment, which was the ark, was saved. And likewise, anyone who puts their faith in Christ today is saved. And you're not sealed by your own effort. You're not saved by your own effort. You're sealed by the hand of God. It says in John 10:28, "I will give them eternal life. They will never perish, and no one will pluck them out of my hand." So it's a real similar deal. This is a direct foreshadowing of Christ. And just as the people of Noah's day should have taken the provision that God gave them for that judgment, there's a judgment that's coming upon us, and we need to take Christ's provision and put our faith in Christ. 2 Peter chapter 3, it says, "And the heavens will go out with a great noise, and the elements will melt with fervent heat." And so there is a coming judgment, and it's dissimilar from this one in that it's going to destroy the entire universe, and God's going to create a new heaven and new earth. The last part, after the flood, what happened after the flood? This may give you some clue as to what happened after the flood, but it was basically an ice age. For the first 500 years, as best we can tell, there was 500 years of ice buildup and 200 years of ice melting. Why did we have an ice age? And by the way, evolutionists will tell you that there were multiple ice ages that are millions of years apart. That's what they'll tell you. Don't believe them. There's absolutely no reason to have multiple ice ages at all. All of the evidence can be accounted for with one ice age shortly after the flood. The evolutionists will propose a dust cloud theory for a possible reason as to why we had an ice age. And here's what they say. Other scientists have proposed that the solar system moved through a dust cloud to cause an ice age. They suggest that perhaps the dust cloud was a dirty arm of the Milky Way galaxy. So here's the Earth going through outer space here in our solar system, and our solar system goes into this big dust cloud, and it blocks out the sunlight, and therefore the Earth gets cooler. Well, there's a problem with that. Michael Ord wrote a book, and he analyzed the weather patterns during and after the flood. And he says this: even if there were less sunlight in the past, it would not necessarily lead to an ice age. Colder temperatures are less able to hold water vapor, therefore the amount of rain or snow would be reduced, not increased. See, to have an ice age, you need to have a lot of water vapor in the air. Okay, and you need to have that water being dumped in the form of ice on the land. And then for enough ice accumulation to occur so that in the summertime that ice doesn't completely melt. And that's what you have to have for an ice age. Okay, so it seems counterintuitive, but just decreasing the temperature of the world does not produce an ice age. 60% drop in water vapor carrying capacity as temperature cools from 50 to 28.4 degrees Fahrenheit. So you get, it's not just a linear decrease in water carrying capacity as temperature decreases. You get an exponential asymptotic decrease in water carrying capacity. Another theory, decreased CO2, it has the same problem as the dust cloud. Colder temperatures are less able to hold water vapor. Decreased CO2, you get colder temperatures. Remember global warming, increased CO2? So increased CO2 doesn't help you either, because warming up the world isn't going to produce an ice age either. And unfortunately for the evolutionists, because they believe in millions and millions of years, volcanic activity can't produce an ice age for them either, because the volcanic activity is spread out over hundreds of millions of years. The incidence of volcanic eruptions, they don't have a huge effect on the world the way they would have during the flood. How do we know that there was an ice age? I met some people that actually didn't believe there was an ice age, and they argued with me on it, which is okay. There's a lot of evidence that there was an ice age. Glaciers are basically flowing. They flow down, they create piles of rocks, and they're so heavy that they actually grind the rocks into powder. That's called glacial till. So there's a lot of evidence for huge glaciation covering a lot of North American continent and South America. And there's also glacial grooves. They're actually grooves that are scratched in the rock after the rock is hardened. The weight of the ice scratches grooves into the rock. And so we have a lot of evidence of extensive glaciation over a lot of North America. Here's another chart. Significant parts of South America, most of Europe, New Zealand, parts of Australia are covered with ice. And this happened directly after the flood, if you want biblical context. And so what do we say happened? Well, during the flood, there was a lot of volcanic activity. There were a lot of aerosols and dust that was spewed up into the air. This blocked out quite a bit of sunlight and caused the earth to cool off. And you may be thinking, well, I thought you said that cooling off the earth doesn't really help you get an ice age. Well, I'm getting there. Just for an example of how far ash carries, this was ash from Mount St. Helens eruption, I think in the 80s. And you can see how far the ash carries. So if you have multiple occurrences of these within a year period, you'd have a lot of ash in the air. Mount St. Helens was actually pretty small compared to a lot of the volcanoes out there. Tambora was 80 times larger than Mount St. Helens eruption, for example. So why did we have an ice age? Well, we had warm oceans. Before the flood, the world was a tropical environment. And if you increase the temperature of the oceans by a few degrees, you'll have the air over the oceans being moisture-laden. And as they blow by the land will be relatively cool because of the decreased sunlight coming down and hitting the land. And we're going to have a lot of precipitation fall out as snow. And so that's the justification for an ice age. So we had a lot of really chaotic weather right after the flood. A lot of rainstorms, snowstorms towards the north and south poles, and just a lot of really chaotic weather. A lot of the deserts that are deserts now were originally lush and green. There's evidence that they were lush and green directly after the flood, or at some point in the past, which we would put directly after the flood. Michael Ord, the guy who studied this, is actually a meteorologist. He says that without a catastrophic event, you're not going to get an ice age. There had to be some sort of catastrophic event was the conclusion he came to. So an ice age actually is pretty good evidence for a flood and that the Bible's true. This isn't a very good picture, but this is a simulation they did where they increased the temperature of the oceans by a couple of degrees. And then they mapped out the increase in rainfall that you would get just from that effect. You get a lot more rain precipitated on the land. There's some good analysis behind it. Genesis 8:1 is about 150 days into the flood. God caused a wind to pass over the earth, and the water began to subside. This could be the beginnings of the chaotic weather patterns after the flood. Job is considered one of the oldest books in the Bible. This may be an allusion to an ice age. We don't know, but he says, out of whose womb came the ice and the frost of the heavens? Who fathered it? The waters are hidden like stone, and the face of the deep is frozen. We don't know absolutely that this is referring to an ice age, but it's just one of those interesting things considering the time period in which Job lived. He certainly would have lived during it. And the ice age didn't envelop the entire world. It was mainly in the colder regions. Some of the world was still probably tropical and hot. It wasn't like the entire globe was covered in ice. A lot of people ask about woolly mammoths. Are they pre-flood or post-flood? Woolly mammoths are a type of elephant that basically had hair, and they had hair because they were able to live in colder regions. They're pretty well adapted to living in colder regions. They were post-flood animals that lived during the Ice Age and basically died out. And some of them that would get caught in a snowstorm would get buried alive, and they'd end up frozen in a glacier. And that's how they ended up dying. The Bible says that he flooded the world. He didn't say that he snowed the world to death. So There's actually an interesting article that I've included in there that talk about an elephant in Papua New Guinea. Usually the largest elephants are about 5 tons. Those are the Asian elephants, I believe. These elephants are 7 to 8 tons. And also they have an interesting bone structure that's more similar to that of a woolly mammoth than a normal elephant. And so it seems like some of the genetics are still preserved today, although they don't have hair. Elephants apparently have lost the ability to have lots of hair, but that's definitely not evolution. That's loss of genetic material that's going backwards. So it's just one of those interesting things. It's in Papua New Guinea. This was an interesting thing. Joe Taylor, it was a woolly mammoth tusk that he was refurbishing. When you talk to evolutionists, you get different stories about how long ago they died. Some people say they died only 50,000 years ago. Some say they died 400,000 years ago. I think the ages generally have gotten shorter as the decades have gone by, because I remember when I was a kid that the woolly mammoths supposedly died 400,000 years ago. But these tusks were frozen, and basically they still smelled like rotting woolly mammoths. And I wouldn't expect, if they were tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of years old, for them still to smell like rotting woolly mammoth. And he actually had to go to the neighborhood store and get baby powder and spread it all over them, because they really did stink bad. And there I am straining with my emaciated muscles trying to pick it up. It was 250 pounds. So let's recap. When the flood occurred, the fountains of the deep and the windows of heaven broke forth. It flooded the world. And then at some point during the flood, day 150, God caused the wind to occur. The mountains rose and the valley sank to the place God established for them. And you have the water running off of the land. And you have a lot of volcanic activity occurring during and after the flood. That volcanic activity caused an ash cloud to stay up in the air for a long time, blocking out quite a bit of the rays. And coupled with the warm oceans, we get an ice age. And snow accumulated and it formed ice. And then about 500 years after the flood, the ice began to melt. So that was basically what happened. And the ice age must have been recent. It couldn't have been millions and millions of years ago. What happens to the depth of the oceans when ice accumulates on land? The depths of the oceans decrease. What people did soon after the flood is that you'd have coastal villages and coastal towns that would have been built on the coast. And as that water on the land melted, it filled up the oceans. Those towns got flooded, kind of like Venice today in Italy. We find all kinds of towns all over the place. Egypt, Cuba, India, Bimini Road, the Bahamas, all over the place we find towns that are now covered by water. And that happened and they got flooded basically when the ice started melting the ice accumulation started melting on the land. Fascinating. You see that statue there. That's an Egyptian city covered under 30 feet of water in the ocean. Here's another one in the Black Sea. Summer of 2000, ancient cities discovered underneath 150 foot of water in the Black Sea. Sea level was lower at some point in the past. And so if evolutionists say that the last ice age occurred millions of years ago, they need to explain what these cities are doing. And these cities were only thousands of years old, what they're doing there, buried under water. It seems like the oceans have changed more recently than that. The ocean depths have changed. We're finished the flood section. Now we're going to move into geology. So we're shifting gears here. We're going to talk about the geologic column. It is fictitious. And we're talking about dating methods are unsuitable for determining ages. This is not how to date females. This is dating rocks. Okay. A religion is a set of beliefs concerning the cause, nature, and purpose of the universe. This is what evolution tries to answer. We don't like their answer, but this is what they try to answer. So I think it would be better to classify it as a religion. There are 2 ways to look at the evidence, as I've been saying. And geology is like every other field of science. There's 2 ways to look at it. You can either look at it through man's theories or you can look at it through the Bible. Dr. Steve Austin believed in an old earth, and he has since then changed his views and believes in a young earth. And he said that these are the evidences that convinced him to believe in an old earth. Laminated sedimentary rocks, large canyons with small rivers, petrified forests, coal beds, deposits, peat swamps, and radioisotope dating. Here are the things that convinced him to believe in a young earth. Laminated sedimentary rocks, large canyons with small rivers, petrified forests, coal beds, deposits, and peat swamps, and radioisotope dating. Okay, the same evidences. It depends on how you look at them. That determines what they support. Just to get us sort of into thinking about rocks here, there are basically 3 types of rocks: igneous rocks, sedimentary rocks, and metamorphic rocks. Igneous rocks, think lava. Okay, granite, rhyolite, pumice, obsidian, and basalt are examples of that. Sedimentary rocks is the second type. Think fossils when you see sedimentary rock. And basically, sedimentary rock is sediments that have been carried by water and deposited somewhere, either been covered over or just left there, and the water recedes. And basically, you get rock forming: sandstone, shale, conglomerates, dolomite. Limestones like stalactites and stalagmites, petrified wood, diatomaceous earth, coal. These are all sedimentary rock, think fossils. And we find all of the fossils we find are in sedimentary rock. And then metamorphic rock is basically sedimentary rock that's been under some pressure and temperature, becomes real hard, a lot harder than sandstone. Sandstone you can kind of like break in your fingers, but you can't do that with metamorphic rock. And so think Abraham Lincoln. You think metamorphic rock? Marble. Okay. The geologic column, it is in trouble. Okay. It's been in trouble for a long time, and we're going to talk about it right now. It was fantasized in the late 1700s to the mid 1800s, and it is basically the Bible for the evolutionist and the geologist. There's a similarity between Shakespeare and the geologic column. It can only be found in one place, books. This is the only place that you are going to find a complete set of all the layers of the geologic column. And what the geologic column is the way the theory goes, as you dig down, you're supposed to get to older and older and older rock. And so you go through the Cenozoic era, the Mesozoic era, the Paleozoic era, and the Precambrian era, ideally. Okay, but this just doesn't occur. Dr. Gary Parker, another evolutionist who became a creationist, said this. In one graduate class, and he's a geologist, by the way. In one class, the professor told us we didn't have to memorize the dates of the geologic system since they were far too uncertain and conflicting. Well, that's science. It's good to be able to stand on something, huh? Here's an earth science book. It says, if there were a column of sediments, unfortunately no such column exists. So, well, why do they keep saying this? Well, this is the Grand Canyon, and we find just about more layers of the geologic column in the Grand Canyon than we find anywhere else. How many layers of the 13 layers do we find? 4, maybe 4.5. That's all we find. There's no place in the world where you can dig down and go through each of these layers. They've basically been pieced together from different places on the globe. And notice they're all from the Paleozoic era. Interesting. Not only has it been pieced together from multiple places in the world, there's a lot of instances where the geologic column, there's gaps in layers. And not only that, the two layers are laying comfortably on top of each other as if there wasn't a large amount of time in between them. This is the Jeffersonian and Louisville layer. And there's 50 million years right there. And the evolutionists say that the rate of soil deposition equaled the rate of erosion for 50 million years. Basically, you're left with the missing time there. I don't know about you, that looks pretty flat. They look pretty comfortably laying on top of each other, and there doesn't seem to be a lot of evidence for erosion, at least not 50 million years of erosion in between them. These are called paraconformities, disconformities, or deceptive conformities. And another good example, the thrust plain in Montana, you've got a Cretaceous layer sandwiched between two Mississippian layers, which are supposedly 200 million years apart from each other. And here again, we have a real fine line in between them, and they're very comfortably laying on top of each other. These examples here are basically examples taken from Henry Morris's book, After the Flood, which was written 40 years ago. They're well-documented cases, which is why I took them. And they're still valid. I figure if the evolutionists haven't come up with a good answer for them in 40 years, they're probably not going to. So what do the evolutionists say? Well, they say overthrusting is a possible way that these things can be produced. Okay, overthrusting, basically, you've got a piece of land, you've got an earthquake that occurs, the land gets off kilter, you have some time that passes, you get erosion. Then you have another earthquake that occurs, and the land shifts and moves on top of another piece of land. Okay, this is a nice theory. This does happen. But every time that it happens, there's a lot of evidence that it has happened. The problem is when you try to apply this explanation to locations where there's no evidence that it happens at all, such as the Mythene Peak. This is fascinating because if you drill down to the Mythene Peak, according to evolutionists, you're going to reach 55 million-year-old rock. Then you're going to go to 225 million-year-old rock. Then you're going to go to 180 million-year-old rock, and then you're going to go to 130 million-year-old rock. I don't know how many times you have to shuffle the card deck to get that, but you got to have a lot of overthrusting to produce that type of thing. Also, the Mythene Peak in the Swiss Alps supposedly actually came from Africa. The Matterhorn is another good example. I sort of chose these famous mountains because they're famous and everyone's heard of them. It's supposedly slid over 30 to 60 miles over younger rock. When a geologist doesn't know what to do with the rock, he makes up a story and says, this is what happened. The Lewis overthrust is one of the best examples of why overthrusting is not a good solution to how the rocks got the way they were. What we have here, the darker rock above is supposedly Precambrian, 570 to 3 billion years old, supposedly. And it's lying on top of a Cretaceous layer, which is 136 million years old. Henry Morris talks about this extensively in his book, After the Flood. And the problem here is that there's so much mass, there's so much Precambrian rock here for it to slide, and it's not just a few miles long, it's 350 miles long. It's basically the distance from here to Tulsa long. This is a big, big mountain range. It's 6 miles wide, and it supposedly traveled 35 to 40 miles. And if this was so, you would see a tremendous amount of evidence, rubble, crushed rock, all kinds of evidence for it. And you don't see that. Just to take a closer look, in between, in the Lewis overthrust, you see shale and then limestone, and shale. These are very comfortably laying on top of each other. This isn't crushed powder or round rocks or rubble. These are layers that are still intact. It cannot be explained by overthrusting. They need to come up with another explanation, and they don't have one. So that's a really great example. Another really good example, the Great Unconformity. And you know it's good when they attach the great to it. In the Grand Canyon represents more than 1 billion years of missing material. That's 1 followed by 9 zeros, 1 billion years, right there. So there's all kinds of places, there's all kinds of examples where the geologic column isn't really a column. There's missing years, there's missing gaps. Let's talk about index fossils for a second. If you go to a typical geologist and you hand him a rock and you say, "How old is my rock?" He'll look at the rock, and if you have a fossil in there, he'll look at it and say, "Oh, you're lucky, you have an index fossil." We're going to talk about the circular reasoning that's involved in that. What an index fossil is, it's an animal that went extinct sometime in the past. And this is probably the most famous of the index fossils. It's a trilobite. And they supposedly died 500 to 600 million years ago. So if you find it in a rock, that means that the rock supposedly has to be at least 500 to 600 million years old, because the animal died 500 million years ago. So that's what they tell you, and that's I'd love to have one of those sit in my living room. I'm sure my wife would hate it, but there's circular reasoning implicit in index fossils. If you ask someone how old the rock is, they'll say, "Well, the fossils tell us how old the rocks are." And then you ask someone how old the fossils are. "Well, the layers that the fossils are found in tell us how old the fossils are." And so there's circular reasoning implicit in it. So you have the strata dated by the fossils, and you have the fossils dated by the strata. And it goes around and around and around. And circular reasoning, in case you're wondering, is not good science. Okay? It's fallacious logic. It's a faulty logic. Just a caveat here. Stephen Jay Gould was commenting on the eye of the trilobite. He said, "The eyes of the early trilobites have never been exceeded for complexity or acuity." Lisa Sawyer from Science News says this: "Trilobite eyes have the most sophisticated eye lens ever produced by nature." I don't know if that's true. That may be an exaggeration, but they're definitely complicated. And I don't know what an animal that's supposedly that old is doing with an immensely complicated eye lens. Okay? Seems like it would have taken a lot longer for it to evolve, if it evolved. Really, fossils are dated by the rocks, and the rocks are dated by evolution. It's fascinating to me if you read your high school biology book very closely. And as I was doing this presentation, I went back to my high school biology book to see what kind of lies I was being fed. And they were appealing all over the place to the geologic column for evidence for how we know that certain things evolved from other things. And if you read the geology books, my grandfather was a geologist, they appeal to the biologists for how we know that certain rocks, which have certain fossils, how old they are. And so geologists are appealing to the biologists are appealing to the geologists, and no one really is holding the bag of information. They're just appealing to each other's authority. American Journal of Science says this: "The intelligent layman has long suspected circular reasoning and the use of rocks to date the fossils and fossils to date the rocks. The geologist has never bothered to think of a good reply, feeling that explanations are not worthy the trouble as long as the work brings results." You've got to get that research money, right? The rocks do date the fossils, but the fossils date the rocks much more accurately. I'll let that one sink in a minute. I don't know how that's possible, but they're the scientists. So stratigraphy cannot avoid this kind of reasoning if it insists. I don't think it can. I think this is implicit in the evolutionary fossil record. The charge of circular reasoning in stratigraphy can be handled in several ways. It can be ignored as not the proper concern of the public. Translation: you have no right to question us. It can be denied by calling down the law of evolution. I love the absolutism they have there. It can be admitted as common practice, and it is, or it can be avoided by pragmatic reasoning. I don't think they can avoid it by pragmatic reasoning. I think it's inherent in their philosophy, the theories. So the geologic column doesn't work. It's just poorly executed, and it really doesn't explain anything. And so if as an engineer I designed something that didn't work, I certainly wouldn't be touting it like it was great stuff. So, dating methods. Do they prove the Earth is millions of years? We're going to spend basically the rest of the time on dating methods here, dating rocks. we're going to talk about carbon-14 dating and a lot of different radiometric compounds that you can use to date things. And carbon-14 is one of them, and basically they all have the same assumptions built into them. And no, it doesn't disprove creation. There's 6 different elements here that can be used to date things radiometrically. They all have really large half-lives. And what half-lives is the rate at which the radioactive compound breaks down. Okay, and it's a predetermined rate. Carbon-14 is usually used to date things that are less than 50,000 years because it has such a young half-life of 5,700 years, whereas all the others have half-lives of hundreds of millions or billions of years. So if someone's telling you that they radiocarbon dated something to millions of years, you can call their bluff because they're lying to you. Radiocarbon dating does not go beyond 50,000 years, and that's pushing it. It's interesting. The dates were firmly established in the mid-1800s for the geologic column. The dates for the Mesozoic, Paleozoic, and Cenozoic eras. And they're actually written on there, the actual dates that they were created. And radiometric dating techniques have not added to the accuracy of the dates that the evolutionists set. And this should be the first indication that the geologic column isn't very accurate. And it should also indicate that the radiometric dating techniques aren't very good either. Where does carbon-14 come from? Well, it comes from the atmosphere. The atmosphere is 78% nitrogen, 21% oxygen, and a very small percentage carbon dioxide. An even smaller percentage of that carbon dioxide is radioactive. Carbon-14 is produced in the atmosphere by the sun. It breaks back down to nitrogen at a rate of 1/2 every 5,730 years. So if you had a handful of radioactive carbon-14 in 5,730 years, you would have half of the radioactive elements as you had before, when you first had it. Okay, during photosynthesis, plants take in CO2. Some of that CO2 is carbon-14, and they basically make it part of their tissue. Animals eat carbon-14, which is in the plants, and they incorporate it in their bodies. Okay, so the assumption is that you have the same concentration of carbon-14 in the atmosphere as you have in plants, as you have in animals. And so what happens when a person dies, or when any animal dies, they're not eating plants, so they're not replenishing that carbon-14. And so every 5,730 years, the concentration halves again and again. And by the time you get to 50,000 years, you basically have no measurable amount of carbon-14. Now, there's a problem here, though, and that's that the assumption is that the amount of carbon-14 in the atmosphere is the same. What happens if the carbon-14 in the atmosphere was different sometime in the past? That'd throw the whole calculations off, wouldn't it? You wouldn't get any right answers. Well, that's exactly what we've seen. If you have carbon-14 forming at the same rate as you have it decaying, it's called an equilibrium. We don't see an equilibrium. It's been calculated that it would take 30,000 years for the Earth's atmosphere to reach equilibrium. Well, whoa, back up the truck. I thought the Earth was billions of years old, or millions of years old at least. How come we haven't reached an equilibrium yet? It seems like we would have reached it a long, long time ago. So the fact that the atmosphere is not at an equilibrium of carbon-14 shows that the Earth is young. There's actually quite a bit more formation than decay, 28 to 37% faster by some measurements. This basically throws off the entire concentration. And if we have an increased production in carbon-14 today, that means sometime in the past there was less carbon-14 in the atmosphere. The question is how much carbon-14 was there pre-flood? And you might assume that there was less, and that may be why we get dates of 30,000 years from carbon-14 dating for pre-flood animals. There might have been less carbon-14 back then. Just something to think about. Just to help explain this, we usually set a candle here and we light it before class, and everyone's wondering what it is, but I didn't do that. Pretend like this is a real candle. We're going to use empirical science to determine when this was lit. We can measure the height of it. It's 7 inches. What's the rate of burn? Well, let's say 1 inch per hour. Okay, so it's burning at a rate of 1 inch per hour. And when was it lit? Tell me when it was lit. Okay, well, you don't know, do you? You need to make some assumptions. Make some assumptions. How tall was it originally? That's what you have to ask. How much carbon-14 was there originally in the atmosphere? You can't answer it unless you know. If it was 15 inches tall, then it's taken, well, it's only 7 inches here, so it would have taken 8 hours. It would have been burning 8 hours. But if it was only 10 inches tall, then it would have only been burning 3 hours. Okay, we don't know. So there are a lot of assumptions involved in the radiometric dating techniques. So there are other glaring problems with carbon-14 dating, and that's that we have a lot of examples of it not working in the field. Okay, a lot of examples. And these are not isolated cases. There's a lot of examples. And there's actually a book written by Woodmarup, and he has an entire chapter 4 debunking the myth that there's only a few isolated examples of carbon-14 dating that don't work. There's a lot of examples. Living mollusk shells were basically killed, and they took a sample of it and sent it off to the labs, and it came back with an age of 2,300 years. So 2,300 years off. This is from the Proceedings of the 12th Nobel Symposium in New York. If a C14 date supports our theories, we put it in the main text. If it does not entirely contradict them, we put it in a footnote. And if it is just completely out of date, we just drop it. Well, that's scientific. A freshly killed seal was carbon dated as having died 1,300 years ago. One part of a baby frozen woolly mammoth was dated 40,000 years. Another part was 26,000 years. And the wood around the carcass was 9 to 10,000 years. Okay, these all have to be the same age, guys. Which is it? It's between 9 and 40,000 years. Well, that's accurate. Great. Anthropological Journal of Canada says this: no matter how useful it is, though the radiocarbon method is still not capable of yielding accurate and reliable results, there are gross discrepancies, the chronology is uneven and relative, and the accepted dates are actually selected dates. The whole blessed thing is nothing more than 13th century alchemy. And it all depends upon which funny paper you read. You can see the frustration with this person because they've got this tool here which is going to supposedly help them date these rocks, and it's basically useless to them because he's not producing any new information in it. And very seldom do you see people who are actually honest like this, but it's kind of refreshing. This is a good one. A living snail was killed and sent off to the labs, and it was carbon dated at 27,000 years. And this is my favorite one. In the last 2 years, an absolute date has been obtained for the Nongdong beds above the Trinil beds, and the very interesting value of 300,000 years plus or minus 300,000 years. I'm glad we got that cleared up. It's between 0 and 600,000 years old. So I'm going to tell you exactly how much money I have in my bank account. I have between 0 and $600,000. Did I tell you anything? No. It's a lot closer to 0. Living penguins have been dated as being 8,000 years old. Material from layers where dinosaurs are found, carbon dated at 34,000 years. Whoa, dinosaurs. Why are they carbon dating dinosaurs? They died 65 million years ago. Russian scientists Kuznetsov and Ivanov carbon dated dinosaur bones at 30,000 years. Hugh Miller, Columbus, Ohio, had 4 dinosaur bone samples, not just 1, 4, carbon dated at 20,000 years. Wow. These samples were not identified as dinosaurs in advance. Why do you suppose that was? I think they would have thrown the samples back at them and said, oh, we're not going to use carbon-14 to date these. We're going to use helium-argon dating or something like that. The fact that there's even carbon-14 in these dinosaur bones indicates that they did not die 65 million years ago. There's no way. Okay, this is an anomaly that evolutionists need to explain. So the things to consider about dating. Samples of known age, radioisotope dating doesn't work. And so what can we assume of samples of unknown age? We should assume that it won't work for samples of unknown age, but evolutionists assume that it does work. American Journal of Science, radiometric dating would not have been feasible if the geologic column had not been erected first. Apart from very modern examples, which are really archaeology, I can think of no cases of radioactive decay being used to date fossils. The mythology of modern dating methods. John Widmer. He spent an entire chapter 4 on examples and talking about how often it comes up that the radiometric dating techniques come up wrong. Okay, and it's a good book. It's like a Noah's Ark, a feasibility study. It's very, very detailed. But if you like the detailed stuff, this would be a good book to get. Next, we're basically going to cover geology and rapid burial. We're going to finish up the geology section, and then we're going to do biology. We're going to do dinosaurs and ancient man, and then we're going to do astronomy. So there's a lot coming up. Let me pray, and then I'll open it up for questions. So.